A 45-year-old woman drove through the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia with everything she owned packed into 3 cardboard boxes and a child who hadn't spoken a full sentence in 6 days. Her name was Ellery Calloway. She had saved lives for 17 years inside the trauma ward of a Richmond hospital held strangers' hands, while their hearts stopped and restarted those hearts more times than she could remember. But she could not fix the one thing breaking quietly inside her own daughter. And she could not go back to the grandmother whose house she was driving toward because that grandmother had been dead for 3 years, and Ellery never once came home to say goodbye. People in the town below called her selfish. Some called her worse. But what none of them knew was that inside that old house on the mountain, someone had kept the fire burning in the fireplace every single night since Cora Calloway died. And nobody in the valley could explain why. If stories about family and second chances mean something to you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications before we continue. This one stays with you. The road climbed higher through bare November trees that looked like charcoal sketches against a sky the color of old pewter. Ellery's hands gripped the steering wheel of a 12-year-old Subaru wagon with a cracked windshield and a heater that only worked on the driver's side. In the rearview mirror, Rosemary sat in the back seat with a sketchbook open across her knees, drawing something Ellery couldn't see. Rosemary was 8 years old, thin-wristed and watchful with dark brown hair that fell unevenly past her shoulders, because Ellery had cut it herself 2 weeks ago in a motel bathroom outside Charlottesville. The girl had her father's quiet eyes, gray-green and serious, the kind of eyes that notice too much for a child her age. She drew constantly. Trees, houses, animals, people she had never met. Sometimes she drew rooms she had never entered, and those drawings unsettled Ellery in ways she could not explain. Rosemary's father had signed the divorce papers 14 months ago and moved to Denver with a woman who sold real estate. He called on Sundays sometimes. Rosemary answered sometimes. The math of their broken family had settled into something neither painful nor painless, just quiet like a room nobody used anymore. Ellery had not planned to come back to Greylock, Virginia. She had planned, if she was being honest, to never come back at all. 7 years. That was how long it had been since she last stood inside her grandmother's kitchen. 7 years since Cora Calloway. 78 years old with hands that smelled permanently of cinnamon and apple butter, had watched Ellery drive away down this same mountain road without turning around. Ellery told herself she was busy. The hospital needed her. Patients needed her. Richmond needed her. Every excuse sounded reasonable from 100 miles away. Then Cora got sick. Ellery sent money. Cora got worse. Ellery sent more money and a card with flowers on the front that said things she couldn't say out loud. Then one Tuesday morning in March 3 years ago, Ellery's phone rang during a double shift in the emergency ward while she was holding pressure on a teenager's gunshot wound. She answered 40 minutes later. By then, Cora Calloway had already been dead for an hour. Ellery did not attend the funeral. She told people the hospital couldn't spare her. That was a lie. The truth was simpler and worse. She was afraid that standing inside her grandmother's kitchen without her grandmother in it would make the guilt real enough to kill her. Now the county had sent a letter. Certified mail forwarded twice before reaching Ellery at the apartment she could no longer afford in Richmond. 60 days. That was how long remained before Cora's house would be seized for unpaid property taxes and transferred to Ridgeline Development Corporation for their planned mountain resort expansion. 60 days before the last piece of Cora Calloway disappeared from the Blue Ridge forever. Ellery quit her job on a Friday, packed 3 boxes on a Saturday, pulled Rosemary out of school on a Monday, and drove south toward a place she had spent 7 years pretending did not exist. The town of Greylock sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridges, population 1,100 on a generous day. Main Street was 4 blocks of brick storefronts with awnings faded by decades of mountain weather. A hardware store, a post office, a diner called Earl's that had been run by 3 different families since the 1960s, none of them named Earl. A church with a white steeple that leaned slightly east as though even the building was tired of standing up straight. Ellery drove through without stopping. She did not want to be recognized yet. Small towns had long memories, and this one remembered everything, especially the granddaughter who abandoned Cora Calloway. The road past town climbed another 2 miles through bare oak and hickory forest before reaching the gravel driveway that turned sharply uphill toward the house. Ellery almost missed it. The wooden mailbox post had rotted sideways, and the driveway entrance was nearly hidden by overgrown laurel bushes. She turned the wheel slowly. Gravel popped beneath the tires. Rosemary looked up from her sketchbook for the first time in an hour. The house appeared through the trees gradually, the way memories sometimes surface piece by piece rather than all at once. A 2-story clapboard farmhouse with a deep front porch and green shutters that Cora had repainted every spring for as long as Ellery could remember. The shutters were still green, though the paint had cracked and blistered across most of them. The porch steps sagged on the left side. One window on the second floor was covered with plywood. Dead leaves packed the gutters thick enough to sprout small plants. But the chimney was breathing. Thin gray smoke rose from the stone chimney to the November sky, curling upward through the cold air like a question nobody had asked. Ellery stopped the car in the middle of the driveway and stared. That was impossible. The house had been empty for 3 years. The county notice said so. The lawyer's letter said so. Nobody lived here. Rosemary pressed her face against the car window. "Mama, there's a light on inside." Ellery's chest tightened. She sat motionless for nearly a full minute, her breath fogging the windshield while the engine idled. Then she turned off the ignition, opened her door and stepped into the cold mountain air that smelled exactly the way it always had. Wood smoke, wet leaves, and something faintly sweet she could not name but recognized immediately. That smell had lived inside her grandmother's kitchen for 60 years. She climbed the porch steps, slowly testing each board. Rosemary stayed close behind her, one small hand gripping the back of Ellery's jacket. Before Ellery could knock, the door opened. An old man stood in the doorway holding a kerosene lantern. He was tall, maybe 6'1" once though. Age had curved his spine forward into a permanent lean. His face was narrow and deeply weathered with white stubble covering sharp cheekbones, and a jaw that looked like it had been set in disappointment decades ago and never fully relaxed. His hands were the most striking thing about him, large-knuckled, trembling faintly but precise. The hands of someone who had spent a lifetime working with very small, very delicate things. His name was Pratts. He was 74 years old, and the first thing he said when he saw Ellery was spoken in a voice rough enough to sand wood. "We already told Ridgeline we're not leaving." Ellery frowned. "I'm not from Ridgeline." Herschel's eyes moved to Rosemary, then back to Ellery. His grip on the lantern shifted. Behind him, another figure appeared, smaller. A woman wrapped in a heavy knitted shawl the color of oatmeal with silver-white hair braided loosely and soft brown eyes that held more warmth than the fireplace glowing behind her. Dorothea Pratt, 70 years old. Dotty to anyone she trusted. She had been a grade school teacher for 31 years in the valley below and still remembered the name of every child she ever taught. Though lately she sometimes forgot where she had set her reading glasses. Cataracts had begun clouding her left eye, and her breathing came shallow when she stood too long. Dotty studied Ellery's face for several seconds with an expression that moved from confusion to something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. Her voice came thin, careful. "You're Cora's girl." Ellery's throat closed. Nobody had called her that in years. Herschel lowered the lantern slowly. His jaw worked once-twice like he was chewing a sentence he didn't want to swallow. Then he stepped aside and opened the door wider without a word. Inside the house looked different and exactly the same. The floorboards had been repaired in places with mismatched wood that didn't quite line up. The kitchen table was the same oak table Cora had owned forever, though one leg had been reinforced with a hand-carved replacement. A wood stove burned steadily near the back wall, and blankets hung drying across a line strung between two ceiling hooks. The wall still held Cora's things, framed photographs of mountain wildflowers, a ceramic rooster on a shelf above the stove, 3 copper pots hanging in descending size beside the kitchen window. And in the far corner of the living room, positioned on a small wooden stand Ellery had never seen before, was a photograph of Cora Calloway herself, cleaned carefully, surrounded by a simple wreath of dried lavender. Someone had been taking care of her grandmother's memory. Ellery stood in the center of the kitchen, unable to speak. Rosemary moved past her quietly and walked straight to the fireplace, standing before the low flames with her sketchbook pressed against her chest, staring into the light as though it had told her a secret. Herschel watched from near the counter. His arms were crossed, but there was no hostility in his posture. Only caution, the caution of a man who had been surprised too many times by people who came to take things. Dottie brought Ellery a cup of tea without asking. The mug was one Ellery recognized, white ceramic with a small chip near the handle, the word Greylock printed in green letters around the base. Cora's mug. Ellery wrapped both hands around it and felt the warmth seep into her cold fingers. Dottie sat across from her at the kitchen table. The older woman's breathing was slightly labored, as though even the effort of making tea had cost her something. "How long have you been living here?" Ellery asked. Herschel answered from across the room, his voice carefully neutral. 3 years this December. Ellery looked between them. 3 years, since before the funeral. Dottie shook her head gently. "Cora invited us." Her soft voice carried the particular steadiness of someone who has told difficult truths enough times to say them without flinching. "We lost our home in Elkton after Herschel's shop closed. Medical bills for my heart. Cora heard about it from someone at church. She showed up at the shelter in Staunton where we were staying and said she had a spare room and more food than one woman could eat alone." Herschel's jaw tightened slightly. "She didn't ask us to pay rent. She asked us to help her keep the garden alive." That sentence hit Ellery in a place she wasn't prepared for. Her grandmother, alone on this mountain, aging and sick, had driven 40 miles to a homeless shelter to bring 2 strangers into her home. Not because she needed help, because they did. And Ellery had been 100 miles away in Richmond, too busy saving strangers in an emergency room to save the one person who had raised her. Dottie reached across the table and rested her thin fingers on Ellery's wrist. Her touch was light, almost weightless. "She talked about you all the time." Ellery pulled her hand away gently. She wasn't ready for kindness yet. Kindness made the guilt worse. Later that evening, after Rosemary had fallen asleep on the old couch near the wood stove with her sketchbook open across her chest, Ellery sat alone in the kitchen reading the county seizure notice for the 4th time. 60 days. The numbers on the page blurred. Property tax arrears, penalty interest, administrative fees. The total was staggering for a house this modest. Something didn't make sense. Cora had been careful with money her entire life. She canned her own food, mended her own clothes, drove the same truck for 22 years. She never carried debt. The idea of Cora owing this much in back taxes felt wrong in a way Ellery couldn't articulate, like finding a word misspelled in a book her grandmother had written. She was still staring at the notice when her eyes drifted toward the kitchen counter. The bottom drawer, the one Cora always called the junk drawer. Ellery opened it the way you open a door to a room you're not sure you want to enter. Inside, beneath a tangle of rubber bands and old receipts, was a notebook. Hardcover, cloth-bound, the deep reddish-brown of autumn leaves. The cover was stained with years of kitchen life flower dust, in the spine a faint ring from a coffee mug. A smear of something golden near the bottom corner that looked like dried apple butter. Ellery opened it. The first page was written in Cora's handwriting, the same careful cursive Ellery had grown up reading on birthday cards and grocery lists. But this wasn't a grocery list. It was a recipe for buttermilk biscuits detailed down to the temperature of the butter, followed by 3 lines of handwritten notes in smaller script beneath the instructions. Made these for Ellery's first morning here. She was 4. Burned the first batch. She ate them anyway and said they tasted like clouds. Lord, give me enough mornings to keep burning biscuits for that child. Ellery closed the notebook. She closed it the way you close a wound you are not ready to clean yet quickly with pressure, hoping it will hold. Her hands were shaking. She sat alone in the kitchen for a long time after that, listening to the fire crackle in the wood stove and the old house settle around her in the dark. The next morning arrived grey and raw with fog settling into the valley below the house like smoke poured from the sky. Ellery woke on the floor beside the couch where Rosemary still slept, a quilt pulled up to her chin. She could not remember deciding to sleep there. Herschel was already in the kitchen. He moved slowly, pouring coffee from a dented percolator that Ellery recognized as Cora's, the same one she kept on the second shelf for as long as Ellery had memories. The smell filled the room dark and bitter, and familiar enough to make Ellery's chest ache. Herschel set a mug on the table without speaking. Ellery sat down. For several minutes neither of them said anything, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who understood that some mornings required nothing more than coffee and the willingness to sit still. Then Herschel spoke, his voice low enough that it barely rose above the sound of wind outside. You came back because of the county notice. It wasn't a question. Ellery nodded once. Herschel turned his mug slowly between his trembling hands. There was a precision in the movement, the habit of a man who had spent decades handling watch gears and mainsprings, tiny things that required enormous patience. Your grandmother fought them for years before you knew. His grey eyes lifted toward Ellery. Ridgeline development. They first came to her in 1987. Ellery frowned. That's almost 40 years ago. Herschel nodded. They wanted the whole ridgeline back then. Resort development, luxury cabins, golf course above the valley. Most families sold because the offers were big and the winters were hard. He paused. Cora told them no. Ellery stared at him. She never mentioned it, not once. Herschel's mouth thinned into something that was almost a smile, but carried no happiness. That woman mentioned a lot of things to a lot of people. But the things that mattered most she wrote down and kept quiet about. His eyes moved toward the drawer where Ellery had found the notebook. You opened it, he said. Again, not a question. Ellery said nothing. Herschel looked toward the window where fog pressed against the glass. She always said you'd come back for it. Ellery set her coffee down slowly. She said that Herschel's voice roughened at the edges the way old wood splinters under pressure, every single week. Right up until the end. The silence that followed filled the kitchen like cold water. Ellery looked down at her hands, the same hands that had restarted hearts and sutured wounds and held dying strangers steady through their worst moments, and realized they were completely useless here. There was no procedure for this kind of damage, no training, no protocol. Cora had waited for her. Cora had waited 7 years and Ellery never came. Later that morning, Ellery opened the notebook again. This time she forced herself to turn past the biscuit page, past a recipe for corn chowder, annotated with notes about which neighbor preferred extra pepper, past a page of strawberry jam instructions that included a small pencil sketch of the garden where the berries grew. She reached a page near the middle of the book. The recipe was for apple butter. The handwriting was slightly different here, tighter, as though Cora had written it under pressure. The date was marked clearly in the margin, November 1987. Below the recipe in smaller script, Cora had written, "Today I signed the refusal for the first time." Mitchell Caldwell came to the porch with papers and a smile that reminded me of someone trying to sell you your own shoes. I told him this land wasn't mine to sell. It belongs to the people who will need it after I'm gone. He laughed. He will come back. They always come back. Ellery read the passage twice. Mitchell Caldwell. The surname landed in her mind with weight. The man currently leading Ridgeline Development's acquisition campaign in Greylock. was named Mercer Caldwell, father and son or something close to it. This had not started recently. This was a 40-year siege. Her grandmother had been the last holdout on this ridgeline for 4 decades. Not because the land was valuable to Cora in dollars, but because she understood something about it that the developers never would. A home is not a property. A home is the place you refuse to abandon even when abandoning it would be easier. The irony cut Ellery so deeply she had to stand up and walk outside. She stood on the porch for a long time breathing cold mountain air and watching fog drift through the bare trees. Rosemary appeared beside her, eventually sketchbook under one arm, and sat down on the top step without saying anything. The girl opened to a blank page and began drawing the view in front of her. The ridge, the trees, the fog. She drew the chimney smoke too, a thin line rising from the roof above them. Ellery looked down at the drawing. Her daughter had drawn smoke coming from a house they were standing inside. Somehow that small detail felt like the truest thing anyone had said in days. By afternoon, Ellery had walked the entire property. The house sat on 11 acres of forested mountainside, with a small apple orchard behind the back fence that Cora had planted in the early 1960s. Most of the trees looked neglected, but alive, their bare branches reaching upward through the fog like open hands. A root cellar built into the hillside still held rows of empty canning jars on wooden shelves. The garden beside the house was overgrown but not destroyed. Herschel had maintained the borders with careful stonework. Dottie came outside briefly around 2 o'clock, moving slowly with one hand pressed against the porch railing. Her breathing seemed worse today, shallow and careful, as though each inhale required a small negotiation with her own lungs. She watched Ellery examining the property line fence with an expression that mixed concern with something gentler. "You don't have to do this alone," Dottie said from the porch. Ellery didn't turn around. "I know." But her voice said the opposite, and Dottie was too old and too wise to pretend she hadn't heard it. The car arrived just before 4 o'clock. Ellery heard it before she saw it. A clean, deliberate engine sound moving up the gravel drive, too smooth for the kind of trucks people drove in Greylock. She came around the side of the house and stopped. A dark gray sedan, spotless despite the mountain mud, rolled to a stop near the porch. The man who stepped out looked like he had been assembled from a catalogue of expensive restraint. Tall early 50s with silver-streaked dark hair combed precisely back from a high forehead. His overcoat was charcoal wool tailored close. His shoes were leather polished absurd on a gravel driveway in November. He carried a thin leather folder under one arm. Mercer Caldwell smiled the way certain men smile at women they have already decided to outlast. His voice was warm, measured, the voice of someone who had been trained to make bad news sound like a favor. "Miss Calloway, I heard you'd come home. I wanted to welcome you personally and see if we might have a conversation about the property's future." Ellery crossed her arms. She was still wearing the flannel shirt she'd slept in, her hair unwashed, her boots muddy. She did not care. "Who told you I was here?" Mercer's smile didn't change. "Small town, word travels." Herschel appeared on the porch behind Ellery. His face had gone completely still, the careful blankness of a man conserving his energy for a fight he knew was coming. Mercer opened the leather folder and produced a single sheet of printed paper. "Ridgeline Development is prepared to offer well above market value for this parcel. Given the tax situation, I'd imagine that's welcome news." He extended the paper toward Ellery with the ease of someone offering a napkin at dinner. Ellery didn't take it. "This land isn't for sale." Mercer studied her for a moment. His expression shifted by exactly 1 degree from warmth to patience, the kind of patience that contains no kindness. "Miss Calloway, I understand the sentimental attachment. I do. But the county has a deadline, and sentiment doesn't pay property taxes." Then his eyes moved to the porch, where Rosemary had appeared in the doorway, sketchbook in hand, watching the stranger with her wide gray-green eyes. Mercer looked at the girl for a moment too long. His voice softened in a way that made Ellery's stomach turn. "Beautiful child. I hope she gets a chance to grow up somewhere stable." The air between them changed. Ellery took one step forward, placing herself directly between Mercer's line of sight and her daughter. Herschel moved to the edge of the porch steps. Dottie's hand appeared on Rosemary's shoulder, pulling the girl gently back inside. Nobody spoke. The fog drifted between the trees. Somewhere in the valley, a dog barked once and stopped. Mercer Caldwell closed his leather folder slowly. He looked at Ellery with an expression that wasn't anger. It was certainty. The absolute certainty of a man who believed that time, money, and exhaustion would eventually do his work for him. He nodded, once turned back to his sedan, and drove away without another word. Ellery stood in the driveway until the sound of the engine faded completely. Her hands were trembling, but not from the cold. Behind her, Herschel's voice came low and steady from the porch steps. "He'll come back." His father came back. They always come back. Ellery turned toward the house. The smoke from the chimney rose into the darkening sky above the roofline. Inside, through the kitchen window, she could see Rosemary sitting at the oak table drawing something. The girl's pencil moved steadily across the page. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Ellery would find the drawing left on the kitchen table. It showed a woman standing between a house and a tall man in a dark coat. The woman's feet were planted wide. Her hands were fists. Rosemary had drawn her mother as someone who was not going to move. Ellery picked up the drawing and held it for a long time in the kitchen, where her grandmother once burned biscuits on purpose just to hear a 4-year-old laugh. The wood stove ticked and settled. The old house breathed around her in the dark. And from inside, the cloth-bound notebook still resting on the counter between recipes for corn chowder and strawberry jam. Cora Calloway's handwriting waited patiently for her granddaughter to turn the next page. Morning arrived not with light, but with sound. Rain against the tin roof of the back porch, steady and cold, the kind of November rain that felt personal. Ellery lay on the floor beside the couch where Rosemary slept and listened to the house leak in 3 places she could count without opening her eyes. She found the first leak above the hallway water, dripping into a saucepan Herschel had already placed there some time before dawn. The second leak ran down the inside of the bathroom wall, darkening the plaster in a widening stain. The third came through the ceiling of the upstairs bedroom, directly onto the mattress where Cora had once slept. Ellery stood in that doorway for a long time, watching rain soak into the quilt her grandmother had made by hand. Then she went downstairs, put on her boots, and climbed onto the roof. She had never repaired a roof in her life. 17 years in a trauma ward had taught her how to stop arterial bleeding with 2 fingers and a folded gauze pad. It had not taught her how to patch a tin roof in the rain. She slipped twice on the wet metal before she even reached the first damaged section. The third time, her foot went through a rusted panel up to her knee, tearing her jeans and cutting a shallow gash across her shin that bled freely into her sock. She sat on the wet roof, holding her leg, rain streaming down her face, and for one brief and terrible moment, she considered climbing down, getting in the car, and driving back to Richmond without a word. Then she heard the back door creak open below. Herschel stood in the yard looking up at her with his collar turned against the rain. He didn't say anything about the blood on her leg. He didn't say anything about her technique. He simply disappeared into the shed behind the house and came back carrying a toolbox, a roll of roofing tar paper, and a short aluminum ladder. He climbed up slowly, one rung at a time, his arthritic hands gripping each step with the same deliberate precision he must have used 1,000 times, adjusting watch mechanisms smaller than his thumbnail. When he reached the top, he knelt beside the damaged panel without looking at Ellery and opened the toolbox. Then he placed a tin snip in her hand, positioned her fingers around the handle, and pointed to the rusted edge. Cut here. Not deeper than the seam. That was all. He didn't take over. He didn't explain more than she needed. He simply knelt beside her in the rain and handed her the right tool at the right moment. The way someone who had fixed broken things his entire life understood that the real work always belongs to the person willing to stay on the roof. They patched 3 sections before the rain stopped. Ellery's hands were raw and her back ached from crouching. But when she climbed down and looked up at their work, the patches were uneven and ugly and absolutely watertight. Herschel put the toolbox away without comment. But as he passed her on the way inside, he paused just long enough to say, "Your grandmother fixed that same spot twice. Made it worse the first time too." Ellery didn't know if that was meant as comfort or instruction. It worked as both. The days that followed blurred together into a rhythm of cold mornings and sore muscles and small failures that gradually became smaller. Ellery replaced 3 sections of the porch railing using lumber Herschel cut to size in the shed. She recaulked the bathroom window. She cleared the gutters by hand, pulling out compressed leaves that had been rotting there for what looked like 2 full seasons. Every task revealed another one behind it. The kitchen faucet dripped. The back door wouldn't close flush. 2 of the porch steps were soft enough to break under weight. The root cellar door hung from one hinge. It was like pulling a thread on a sweater and finding out the entire thing was one thread. Rosemary watched everything. The girl sat on the porch steps most mornings with her sketchbook drawing Ellery working. Sometimes she drew Herschel standing nearby. Sometimes she drew the house itself, always with smoke rising from the chimney, always with the front door open. Ellery noticed that Rosemary never drew the door closed. She filed that detail away in the part of her mind that worried constantly about her daughter, but didn't know how to ask the right questions. Dottie filled a different space entirely. Mornings when Ellery came inside filthy and exhausted, Dottie had tea waiting without being asked. She never commented on the dirt or the failures. Instead, she talked quietly while Ellery sat at the kitchen table, stories about the children she'd taught over 3 decades, about the way Greylock used to look in spring, when the dogwoods bloomed along the ridge, about the time a black bear wandered into the schoolyard, and the janitor chased it away with a mop, and an authority the bear apparently respected. Dottie's voice had a quality Ellery recognized from the best nurses she'd ever worked alongside. It calmed without demanding attention. It held space without filling it. One evening, Dottie sat beside Rosemary at the kitchen table and opened an old picture book she'd found on a shelf in the spare room. The girl looked at it silently. Dottie didn't push. She simply turned pages at a pace that made it clear there was no hurry, and eventually Rosemary's small hand reached over and stopped a page. "That one," Rosemary said. It was the most words she'd spoken at once since arriving. Dottie looked at the illustration. A fox sitting alone at the edge of a forest watching a farmhouse with lit windows in the distance. "What do you think the fox is thinking?" Dottie asked. Rosemary studied the picture for a long time. Then she picked up her pencil and drew a second fox beside the first one. "Now he's not alone," she said quietly. Dottie looked at Ellery across the room. Neither woman spoke. Neither needed to. The notebook became Ellery's companion during the late hours after everyone else had gone to sleep. She read it the way some people read scripture slowly, 1 page at a time, not because the words were difficult, but because each page changed the weight of the ones that came before. Between a recipe for blackberry cobbler, dated June 2001, Cora had written in her small, precise hand, "Today my granddaughter told me she would never come back to this mountain. She said it's standing right where the dogwoods bloom in April, as though the place meant nothing. I am not angry. Anger is for people who have been surprised. I have been expecting this since the day she left for nursing school and stopped calling on Sundays. I will not chase her. I will keep this kitchen warm, and I will pray that one day she finds her way back before the road gets too long to remember." Ellery read those lines sitting alone at the oak table at 1 in the morning. The wood stove had burned low. The house was silent except for the settling of old beams and the faint sound of Herschel's breathing from the next room. She pressed her forehead against the page and stayed there until the ink blurred. Her grandmother had known, not suspected, not feared. Known. Known that Ellery would leave, known that calling her back would only push her further away, and chosen to wait anyway. Year after year alone on this mountain, keeping the kitchen warm for a granddaughter who might never return. That was not patience. That was faith of a kind Ellery did not know how to deserve. The first batch of apple butter came out wrong. Ellery followed Cora's recipe exactly, or thought she did. Same proportions, same spices, same slow cook instructions. But the result was too thin, too sweet, lacking the depth she remembered from childhood. She stared at the jars cooling on the kitchen counter and felt an irrational fury that surprised her. Dottie tasted it without being asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then gently, "Did you use the late apples from the back orchard?" Ellery had used store-bought apples from the market in Staunton. Dottie nodded slowly as though that explained everything. Cora always said the recipe wasn't in the ingredients, it was in the trees. The next morning, Ellery walked to the back orchard. Most of the trees were neglected branches, tangled and unpruned. But a few still held late-season fruit, small and imperfect, clinging to the limbs, with the stubbornness of things that refused to fall before they were ready. She picked 2 baskets and carried them inside. The second batch was different, darker, richer, with a depth that tasted like the mountain itself. Ellery filled 6 jars and sealed them the way Cora's notes described, wax lids pressed down with the heel of her palm. Herschel tasted it at dinner. He said nothing, but he ate 3 spoonfuls and then set the jar beside his plate instead of returning it to the counter. That was enough. The following week, Ellery drove into Greylock for supplies and stopped at the general store on Main Street. The woman behind the counter was broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her forehead. Opal Hendricks, 63 years old, had run the store alone since her husband died of a stroke 11 years earlier. She spoke the way she stocked shelves efficiently and without waste. Opal recognized Ellery immediately. She didn't say welcome back. She didn't say sorry about your grandmother. She looked at Ellery for 3 full seconds and then said, "You need anything from the back holler. Don't be polite about it. Polite wastes time." Ellery liked her instantly. On the way out, Ellery paused and asked if Opal would be willing to sell a few jars of homemade apple butter on consignment. Opal looked at the jar Ellery had brought as a sample, opened. It smelled it and tasted a fingerful without ceremony. "This Cora's recipe," Ellery nodded. Opal screwed the lid back on. "Bring me a dozen jars by Friday. I'll put them near the register." Her voice carried no sentimentality, but her eyes held something brief and private, the look of someone remembering a taste they thought was gone forever. By the following Tuesday, all 12 jars had sold. Opal called the house phone and said 4 words: "Bring more, charge more." Something shifted in Greylock after that. It happened the way weather changes in the mountains, not all at once, but in pressure drops you feel before you see. A man named Thomas Ware, 67, a retired railroad worker with a permanent limp and a voice like gravel in a coffee can, drove up to the house one morning with fence posts in his truck bed. He didn't knock on the door. He simply unloaded the posts near the broken section of the east fence, nodded to Herschel on the porch, and drove away. 2 days later, someone left a box of canning jars on the front steps overnight with no note attached. The next week, a woman Ellery didn't recognize dropped off a casserole dish at Opal's store with instructions to deliver it to the Calloway place. The dish was still warm. Nobody made speeches. Nobody organized. The help arrived the way spring water moves through limestone, quietly through cracks that were already there. Deputy Colton Ferris came by the house on a Thursday afternoon, lean early 30s, with the careful posture of someone who took his work seriously, but wasn't entirely sure the system he worked inside took it seriously back. He drove a county cruiser that needed new shocks and wore a jacket 1 size too large for his frame. Colton had grown up outside Greylock. His father lost most of their family land during a highway expansion project 15 years earlier, a loss that left Colton with a deep and specific distrust of any organization that treated land as a line item on a spreadsheet. He sat at the kitchen table and spread 3 folders across the oak surface. Ellery leaned forward. Herschel stood near the counter, listening. Colton's voice was low, precise. "I've been looking into Ridgeline's acquisition history in the county. There are patterns." He opened the first folder. elderly property owners signing sales agreements during medical emergencies, widows presented with documents at funerals, contract pages with changed acreage numbers, signatures that don't match public records. He paused and looked directly at Ellery. Your grandmother's property is the last parcel Ridgeline needs to complete their Ridgeline Resort corridor. Every other family on this mountain sold or was forced out over the last 40 years. Every single one. Ellery stared at the folders. How did you find this? Colton closed the nearest file carefully. Started asking questions after the third old couple in 2 years suddenly decided to sell land their families had owned for a century. He met Ellery's eyes. People around here are scared of Ridgeline, but they're more scared of losing everything they have left. He stood slowly squaring the folders against the table edge with a deliberateness that felt like a man putting his own doubts in order. I'm not in a position to make official promises yet, but I'm building something, and it's getting harder for anyone to look the other way. After Colton left, Ellery sat alone at the table for a long time. The folders remained spread open in front of her. 40 years of pressure. 40 years of her grandmother saying no while the rest of the mountain fell away around her. And Ellery hadn't known any of it because she had been too far away to hear. She opened the notebook again that night, turned pages past recipes she hadn't reached yet. And somewhere between a recipe for chestnut soup and a set of instructions for drying herbs in the root cellar, she found a page that stopped her breathing. It was not a recipe, it was a list. Names and dates written in Cora's handwriting spanning nearly 3 decades. Next to each name was a dollar amount and a short note. Anderson family, 1994, $400, furnace repair after fire. Doyle widow, 1998, $250, school clothes for children. Pratt family, 2019 medical fund. Pratt family. Ellery's eyes moved down the list. The amounts varied from $50 to several thousand. The notes were always brief, always practical. Groceries, roof repair, doctor visit, winter fuel. The list filled 2 full pages. Cora Calloway had been quietly giving money to families across the valley for decades. Small amounts never announced, never discussed. The kind of help that arrives without a name attached, exactly like the canning jars and fence posts appearing on Ellery's porch now. And at the bottom of the second page, in handwriting that trembled slightly, as though Cora's hand had been unsteady when she wrote, it was a final entry. Pratt Dorothea, 2021, heart surgery assistance, $14,600. $14,600. Ellery's hands went still on the page. She looked up from the notebook toward the room where Dottie slept. Her grandmother had paid for Dottie's heart surgery. Not partially, not a contribution. She had paid enough to make the difference between life and death for a woman she had known for barely 2 years. And that was why the property taxes went unpaid. That was why the county notice arrived. That was why Cora's house now stood 60 days from seizure. Cora Calloway didn't lose her home because she was careless. She lost it because she chose to save someone else's life instead. Ellery closed the notebook. She pressed both palms flat against the kitchen table and sat perfectly still while the wood stove ticked and the house settled around her. And the weight of her grandmother's choices rearranged everything she thought she understood about this place. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she sat at the table and did math on the back of an envelope. Apple butter sales, what remained in her savings, the repair work she might find in town. It wasn't enough, not close, not for 60 days. But for the first time since arriving, the problem had a shape she could see, and Ellery had spent her entire career working inside impossible timelines with insufficient tools. 16 days passed. The apple butter orders doubled after Opal mentioned Cora's name to a women's group in Staunton. Thomas Ware returned twice more with materials and stayed to help Ellery repair the east fence in silence. A retired school teacher from the valley brought Rosemary a set of watercolor paints, and for 3 days the girl painted everything she saw in colors so vivid the kitchen walls looked like a gallery. Then the orchard was destroyed. Ellery found it on a Tuesday morning. She walked out the back door carrying 2 empty baskets for the late apples and stopped at the edge of the yard. The gate to the orchard hung open, torn from one hinge. Beyond it, half the apple trees had been cut. Not broken by wind, cut. Clean saw marks at the base of trunks Cora had planted more than 60 years ago. The trees lay scattered across the hillside like fallen soldiers, their bare branches tangled together in the cold morning light. Rosemary came around the corner of the house and stopped. She looked at the fallen trees without speaking. Then she sat down on the wet ground, opened her sketchbook, and began drawing them exactly as they lay. Ellery stood in the ruined orchard for a long time. Her hands hung at her sides. No trembling this time. Something harder than fear had settled into her chest. Something that felt like the moment in the emergency room when a patient's vitals crash and panic becomes a luxury you cannot afford. Herschel appeared beside her, leaning on a walking stick. His face was gray. He looked at the stumps and the saw marks and the scattered branches and said nothing for nearly a minute. Then quietly, "They want you tired enough to quit." Ellery turned toward him. Her voice came out steady and flat. The voice she used during traumas when everything was going wrong. And the only useful thing left was clarity. "I quit once. I quit on her. 7 years I stayed away while she held this place together alone. And I told myself I was too busy to come home." She paused. "That's done." Herschel studied her face. Whatever he saw there made him nod once slowly, the way old men nod when they recognize something they've been waiting to see. That evening, Opal drove up the mountain without calling ahead. She carried 2 grocery bags and a look on her face that suggested someone was going to regret making her angry. She walked into the kitchen, set the bags on the counter, and looked at Ellery with her reading glasses still pushed up on her forehead. "Whoever cut those trees left tire tracks in the mud off the county road." Opal's voice was matter-of-fact, almost conversational. Thomas followed them 3 miles to a maintenance lot behind Ridgeline's field office. Ellery felt something cold and precise click into place behind her ribs. Colton arrived an hour later. He photographed the orchard, the saw marks, the tire tracks. He collected samples from the mud near the gate. He did all of it quietly and thoroughly. And this time, something in his posture had changed. The caution from his first visit had been replaced by the controlled anger of a man who had crossed a line inside himself that he couldn't uncross. When he finished collecting evidence, he stood beside his cruiser and pulled a small notebook from his jacket. The pages were dense with handwriting. "I've spent the last 2 weeks pulling every Ridgeline contract filed in this county for the past 15 years. His voice was lower now, harder at the edges. 7 show altered acreage figures. 4 have signatures that don't match any sample on file. 2 families have agreed to testify." He looked at Ellery directly, and the uncertainty she'd seen in his eyes during that first Thursday visit was gone entirely. "This isn't something I can look the other way on anymore. Nobody should." 3 nights later, Ellery woke to the sound of something falling in the kitchen. She was on her feet before the sound finished. Years of night shifts in the emergency ward had made her body faster than her thoughts in the dark. She reached the kitchen doorway in 4 steps and found Dottie on the floor beside the oak table. The older woman was conscious, but barely. Her face was the color of candle wax, one hand pressed flat against her chest. Her breathing came in shallow, uneven pulls, each one sounding like it cost more than the last. Ellery dropped to her knees beside her. "Dottie, look at me. Can you tell me where it hurts?" Dottie's lips moved, but no sound came. Her eyes found Ellery's face and held there wide with the particular terror of someone whose own body has become the emergency. Ellery's training took over the way a river takes over a dry channel completely and without permission. She checked Dottie's pulse. Rapid, irregular weakening. She tilted Dottie's head to keep the airway clear. She spoke in the calm, measured voice she had used 1,000 times in the trauma ward. The voice that said, "You are not alone, and I know what I'm doing, and I will not leave even if both of those things felt uncertain." Herschel appeared in the doorway. The old man's face collapsed when he saw his wife on the floor. He moved toward her, and Ellery stopped him with one raised hand. "Call the ambulance, now. Tell them possible cardiac event, female 70 years old, history of heart condition." Herschel's hands shook so badly he could barely hold the phone. Ellery heard him speaking to the dispatcher while she kept Dottie stable on the kitchen floor. The wood stove crackled. Rain started again against the tin roof. The whole house seemed to contract around the two women on the floor, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Then small footsteps behind her. Rosemary stood in the hallway in her nightgown, clutching her sketchbook against her chest. The girl's eyes were enormous. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply stood there watching her mother kneel on the kitchen floor with her hands on a dying woman's chest, and something in the child's face looked older than 8 years old. Ellery kept her eyes on Dottie. "Rosemary, stay right there. You're doing fine. Just stay right there." The ambulance took 19 minutes. Ellery knew because she counted. 19 minutes of holding Dottie's hand, monitoring her breathing, talking to her in that steady trauma ward voice while Herschel sat on the kitchen floor beside his wife, with tears running silently into his white stubble. At one point, Dottie's eyes fluttered, and she whispered something so faint Ellery had to lean close to hear it. The old woman's breath was warm against her ear. Cora said, "You'd know what to do." The paramedics arrived and took over. Ellery stepped back and let them work, and only then did her hands begin to shake. She stood in the kitchen doorway, watching them carry Dottie out on a stretcher into the rain, and for one terrible clarifying moment, she understood something she had been running from for 7 years. She had not quit nursing because she was burned out. She had quit because every patient she lost reminded her of the one person she should have been there for and wasn't. Every death in that hospital was Cora dying alone on this mountain, while Ellery worked a double shift 100 miles away and told herself she was needed elsewhere. She had been needed here. She had always been needed here. And she had not come. Herschel rode in the ambulance. Ellery stood on the porch watching the red lights disappear down the mountain road into the rain. Rosemary came and stood beside her. The girl's hand found Ellery's hand and held it. After a long silence, Rosemary spoke. Her voice was small but clear against the sound of rain. "Is she going to be okay?" Ellery looked down at her daughter. The honest answer was that she didn't know. The comforting answer was that everything would be fine. She chose neither. "I'm going to make sure she has the best chance." Rosemary considered this. Then she opened her sketchbook to the page she had been working on and held it up in the dim porch light. She had drawn the kitchen. Dottie lying on the floor, Herschel kneeling beside her, and Ellery in the center of the frame, hand steady, face calm, holding everything together while the world fell apart around her. The drawing was the most accurate portrait anyone had ever made of Ellery Calloway, and her 8-year-old daughter had rendered it from memory in the dark. Ellery pulled Rosemary close. The rain fell harder. The chimney still breathed smoke into the black mountain sky. And inside the house, the notebook lay open on the counter, where it had fallen during the commotion turned to a page Ellery had not yet read, where Cora's handwriting waited with one more truth that would change everything. Dottie survived the night. Ellery learned this from a phone call at 6 in the morning, standing barefoot on the kitchen floor with the receiver pressed hard against her ear, while rain still tapped against the windows. The doctor in Staunton used words like stabilized and monitoring, and cautiously optimistic words Ellery had heard 1,000 times from the other side of the conversation. They sounded different when the patient was someone who had made you tea without asking and held your daughter's hand during a thunderstorm. She hung up and stood in the kitchen alone. The wood stove had burned low overnight. The house felt colder than it should have, not from temperature, but from absence. Dottie's chair sat empty at the oak table. Her shawl still hung across the back of it, the color of oatmeal, carrying a faint smell of lavender and wood ash. Rosemary came downstairs holding her sketchbook. She looked at the empty chair, then at her mother, and sat down at the table without asking questions. She opened to a fresh page and began drawing the shawl draped over the chair back. Just the shawl, nothing else. Ellery watched her daughter draw and made a decision that had been forming inside her for weeks. Taking shape the way stalactites form one slow drip at a time, invisible until suddenly it's solid. She picked up the notebook from where it had fallen during the night. It lay open to the page she hadn't read yet, the one Cora's handwriting had been waiting to show her. Ellery sat down at the table across from Rosemary and looked at it. It was not a recipe. It was a letter written in ink that had faded slightly at the edges, dated 1 week before Cora's death. The handwriting was steady for the first 3 lines, then began to waver, as though Cora's hand had been losing an argument with itself about how long it could keep going. Ellery, I'm writing this in the kitchen where you used to sit on the counter and watch me peel apples. You were 5 and you asked me why I peeled them so slowly. I told you that anything worth keeping takes time to uncover. You said that was boring. You were probably right. I'm not angry that you did not come home. I need you to hear that clearly because I know you. And I know you have been carrying guilt the way some women carry purses everywhere all the time, even when there is nothing useful inside. I am angry that you have not forgiven yourself. That is the only thing I will not forgive you for. This house does not need you to save it. You need it to save you. Come home, Ellery, not for the walls or the land or the taxes. Come home because you have been lost for a long time, and this kitchen has always known the way back. There is apple butter in the cellar, 3rd shelf behind the peach preserves. I made it last October. It is the good batch. You will know because it tastes like the mountain. I love you more than you have allowed yourself to believe. Cora. Ellery read the letter twice. Then she folded the notebook closed and pressed both palms flat on the table. Her shoulders shook once, twice. She did not make a sound. Rosemary looked up from her drawing and reached across the table, placing a small hand on top of her mother's wrist. She did not say anything. She simply left her hand there, warm and steady, anchoring Ellery to the kitchen the way Cora's letter had asked. After a while, Ellery went to the root cellar and found the jar exactly where Cora described. 3rd shelf, behind the peach preserves, a single jar of apple butter sealed with wax, labeled in Cora's handwriting, October. The good batch. She carried it back to the kitchen and set it on the table without opening it. Rosemary looked at the jar, then at her mother. Is that Grandma's? Ellery nodded. It took her a moment to trust her voice. She made it for us. Rosemary studied the jar the way she studied everything, with the quiet intensity of a child who understood that some objects carry more weight than their size suggests. Can we open it? Not yet, Ellery said. Not until everyone's home. Herschel returned from the hospital the following afternoon. He looked 10 years older than the man who had climbed a ladder in the rain to help Ellery patch a roof. His shoulders curved inward and his hands trembled more visibly. But his eyes were clear. Dottie was recovering. She would need rest. Weeks of it. No stress, no cold, no strain. He sat on the porch steps and told Ellery this in a voice scraped thin from a night of sitting beside his wife's hospital bed, watching machines do the breathing she couldn't manage on her own. When he finished, he looked out at the ruined orchard and the patched fences and the mountains beyond them, and his jaw tightened. Ellery sat beside him. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The late afternoon light moved slowly across the ridge, turning the bare trees amber. Then Herschel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope, creased and softened from being carried for a long time. He held it between his trembling fingers without opening it. Cora gave me this the week before she passed. His voice was barely above a murmur. She told me to keep it until her granddaughter came home. Not if, until. He looked at Ellery with eyes that had spent a sleepless night beside his wife and still held steady. She never doubted it. Not once, right up to the last morning. He handed it to Ellery. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a receipt from the county clerk's office dated 3 years earlier, showing a payment of $14,600 directed to the medical account of Dorothea Pratt. Attached to the receipt was a handwritten note in Cora's script, just 3 lines. I chose Dottie's heart over the tax bill. I would make the same choice 1,000 times. The house will find its own way home. Ellery held the receipt in both hands. She had already found the number in the notebook. She had already understood the arithmetic. But seeing it now in Cora's handwriting addressed to her through Herschel's trembling hands transformed knowledge into something far heavier. The notebook had told her what happened. This note told her why. Her grandmother hadn't weighed a life against a piece of land and made a difficult calculation. She had made no calculation at all. There had never been a question. Herschel watched Ellery read. When she looked up, the old man's eyes were wet but steady. "She saved Dottie's life," he said, "and last night you saved it again." Ellery looked away toward the mountains. The late afternoon light caught the bare ridgeline and turned it copper. She understood now. Not just the facts, but the shape of what Cora had built on this mountain over 60 years. Every jar of apple butter delivered to a neighbor, every quiet dollar given to a family in trouble, every refusal to sell. It was all the same gesture repeated 1,000 times in 1,000 forms. Staying. Simply, stubbornly, impossibly staying for the people who needed the staying most. And the one time Cora needed someone to stay for her, Ellery had been 100 miles away saving strangers. She pressed the receipt against her chest and felt something break open that she had kept sealed for 7 years. It was not grief. Grief she knew. This was forgiveness arriving uninvited, the way Cora's help always arrived without announcement, without conditions placed quietly on the doorstep of someone who hadn't asked for it. The county hearing was held on a Wednesday morning in the basement of the Greylock courthouse, a room that smelled like floor wax and old paper, and the coffee someone had burned in the machine near the back wall. Ellery arrived carrying 3 folders of documents, Colton's evidence of Ridgeline's fraudulent acquisitions, the notebook, and the receipt showing why Cora's taxes had gone unpaid. Mercer Caldwell sat at the opposite table with a lawyer from Richmond in a suit that cost more than Ellery's car. Mercer looked composed, patient, certain. The hearing officer was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses and the demeanor of someone who had seen enough paperwork to last several lifetimes. Ellery presented the evidence methodically. The forged contracts, the pressured signatures, the pattern of acquisitions targeting elderly landowners during medical crises. Colton testified with the measured confidence of a man who had spent weeks building a case he no longer had any intention of softening. He cited dates, names, document irregularities, each one placed into the record with the same deliberateness he brought to every piece of evidence he'd collected from the orchard mud and the county filing cabinets. The hearing officer reviewed each file without expression. Mercer's lawyer objected twice. Both times the hearing officer overruled him with the same flat look. Then came the part Ellery had not planned. Opal Hendricks stood up from the gallery bench. Nobody had asked her to speak. She walked to the front of the room with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had been running her own store for 11 years and did not require permission to say things out loud. "Cora Calloway paid for my husband's funeral when I couldn't afford the casket." Opal's voice filled the basement without effort. "She showed up at my store the day after he died with an envelope and a pound cake and told me the envelope was from an anonymous donor. Everybody in town knew it was her. Nobody said so because she didn't want them to." Thomas Ware stood next. His deep voice was steady, despite the slight tremor in his hands gripping the back of the bench in front of him. "Cora Calloway drove 40 miles in a snowstorm to bring firewood to my mother's house the winter the furnace broke. My mother was 83. Cora was 71. She stacked every log herself. 2 more people stood, then 3, then 5. Families. Ellery had never met telling stories about a woman who had been quietly holding this community together for decades. A farmer whose well she'd helped repair. A young mother whose grocery bill she'd paid without leaving her name. An elderly veteran whose property taxes she had covered during a hospitalization. The hearing room filled with Cora Calloway's invisible legacy rising from the mouths of people who had carried these stories privately for years and were now speaking them aloud for the first time. Mercer Caldwell's composure began to thin. He shifted in his chair. His lawyer whispered something. Mercer shook his head. The hearing officer removed her glasses and looked at Ellery directly. The property taxes remain outstanding. Ellery's stomach dropped. However, the officer paused. Given the evidence of fraudulent pressure, the documented history of community contribution, and the pending criminal investigation into Ridgeline Development's practices, this office is issuing an indefinite freeze on all seizure proceedings related to the Calloway property. She looked at Mercer. And I am recommending the State Attorney General's office review Ridgeline Development's acquisition history across all 3 counties. Mercer stood. His chair scraped the floor. He looked at Ellery with an expression she recognized from trauma patients in the moment they realized the injury is worse than they thought. Then he picked up his briefcase and walked out of the hearing room without speaking. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. Opal sat back down and adjusted her reading glasses. Thomas nodded once. Colton exhaled slowly and closed his folders. It was the quietest victory Ellery had ever witnessed, and it was the only one that had ever made her cry. Dottie came home on a Saturday. Herschel helped her from the car with both hands moving so carefully it looked almost like dancing. She was thinner, paler. Her breathing still carried the cautious rhythm of a body negotiating with itself about how much effort to allow. But she was standing. She was here. Rosemary waited on the porch, holding something behind her back. When Dottie reached the top step, the girl held out a watercolor painting. She had painted the kitchen. The oak table, the wood stove, the copper pots. 5 chairs instead of 4. Smoke rising from the chimney. Every window lit from inside. Dottie looked at the painting for a long time. Then she pulled Rosemary into the softest embrace Ellery had ever seen, the kind that lasts exactly as long as it needs to, and not a second less. That evening they opened Cora's jar. The 5 of them sat around the oak table, the same table where Cora had written recipes and secrets and quiet acts of love for 60 years, and Ellery unsealed the wax lid with her thumb. The smell rose immediately dark and sweet, and layered cinnamon and slow-cooked apple, and something underneath that was not a spice, but a place. The mountain, the orchard, the kitchen where a woman once burned biscuits on purpose to hear a child laugh. Rosemary tasted it first. She closed her eyes and sat very still. "It tastes like the house," she said. Nobody argued with that. Spring came to the Blue Ridge the way it always comes, slowly. And then all at once, as though the mountain had been holding its breath since November, and finally remembered how to exhale. The dogwoods bloomed along the ridge in April. White blossoms appearing among the bare branches like small pieces of paper left behind by someone in a hurry. The back orchard, half destroyed, sent up new growth from 3 of the cut stumps, pale green shoots reaching upward through the sawdust, with the blind determination of things that don't know they have been killed. Ellery built the kitchen herself. Not a restaurant, not a bakery, just a long wooden table set up on the front porch with a hand-painted sign Rosemary had lettered in watercolor, and Herschel had mounted on 2 posts he carved from leftover fence timber. The sign read, "Cora's Kitchen." Below it in smaller letters, "Come hungry. Leave slow." Every Saturday morning, Ellery made apple butter from the trees that survived, and biscuits from the recipe on the first page of the notebook. Dottie sat in a rocking chair on the porch and talked to every person who came, remembering their names, asking about their children, listening to their stories, with the focused attention of a woman who understood that being heard was a form of medicine no hospital could prescribe. Herschel repaired things. He simply repaired whatever needed repairing. Kitchen chairs, screen doors, a child's broken toy, the hinge on Opal's cash register. His hand still trembled. The work was still precise. Some mornings, Ellery watched him bent over a piece of wood in the shed. and the concentration on his face reminded her of surgeons. She had admired people who understood that steadiness was not the absence of shaking, but the refusal to let shaking stop you. Thomas Ware came every Saturday without fail. He drank coffee and told stories about the railroad and sat in the yard with Rosemary, who drew his portrait so many times that he started bringing different hats each week, so she'd have something new to work with. One warm morning in late April, Ellery carried the oak table outside and set it beneath the old apple tree nearest the house, the largest survivor from the orchard, its branches heavy now with white blossoms that smelled sweet enough to taste. She placed the notebook in the center of the table, open to a blank page near the back. Beside it, she set a pen. Throughout the day, people who came to Cora's kitchen wrote in the notebook. Some wrote recipes. Some wrote the names of family members they'd lost. One woman wrote a single sentence about the best meal she'd ever eaten, which was a grilled cheese sandwich her daughter made for her the day after her husband's funeral. A retired teacher wrote the name of a student she thought about every year on the first day of school. The notebook that Cora Calloway had filled with recipes and secrets and quiet acts of love was becoming something larger now. A record of the things people carry inside them and rarely say aloud. Every page that filled was a page added to a story that Cora started and Ellery continued, and that no single person would ever finish. Late that afternoon, when the visitors had gone and the porch was quiet, Ellery sat at the oak table beneath the apple tree. The light came sideways through the blossoms, casting small round shadows across the table surface. Rosemary sat beside her, painting the tree in watercolor. Dottie dozed in her rocking chair with her shawl around her shoulders. Herschel stood near the porch railing, carving something small from a piece of apple wood. The kitchen smelled the way it always had: cinnamon, wood smoke, apple butter cooling in jars on the counter, and beneath all of it something older and quieter that Ellery finally recognized as the smell of a place that had been loved steadily for a very long time. Ellery opened the notebook to the last page Cora had written the letter. She read it one more time. Then she turned to the blank page directly after it and picked up the pen. She wrote a recipe, simple, direct, in handwriting that looked nothing like her grandmother's and didn't need to. Rosemary's first apple butter, spring. Below it, she listed the ingredients: late apples from the back orchard, cinnamon, brown sugar, patience. And beneath the ingredients, in the space where Cora always left her private notes, Ellery wrote a single line: "Made this with my daughter on the first warm Saturday after the trees came back." The kitchen smelled like the mountain. We burned the first batch. She ate it anyway. She set the pen down. The breeze moved through the apple blossoms and carried their scent across the porch. Rosemary looked up from her painting and studied her mother's face with those gray-green eyes that noticed everything. "What did you write?" Ellery closed the notebook gently and rested her hand on the cover. The cloth felt warm from the sun. The next page. The afternoon light softened. Somewhere in the valley below, a church bell rang once and then was quiet. The chimney breathed a thin line of smoke into the sky above the house where Cora Calloway had kept the fire burning for 60 years, and where her granddaughter had finally come home to learn that the fire was never about the warmth. It was about the staying. Sometimes the people we lose leave behind more than memories. They leave instructions written between the lines of recipes and hidden inside the margins of ordinary days. They leave bread rising in kitchens we haven't entered yet. They leave doors unlocked and lights on in windows we can see from very far away if we are willing to look. And sometimes the hardest journey home is not the distance. It's forgiving yourself long enough to walk through the door and sit down at the table where someone has already set a place for you and has been waiting patiently for you to arrive. If you have a recipe that's been passed down in your family, something your grandmother or mother or father made that tasted like more than food, we'd love to hear about it. Tell us the story behind the dish in the comments. Your memory might remind someone else of theirs. And if stories about coming home and second chances mean something to you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Thank you for staying until the end.